Hello, JP.
Hello.
Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, so good to have you here. And we've done all of the niceties. I've complimented you on your hair. You've fessed up that you've not showered it, but you've made it look like you've showered
Oh,
it.
you're making that public. Yes, indeed.
Oh, that
That's
was
the
just my
magic
ears, was
trick. When I get up at
it?
6 a.m. in Hawaii to take calls, it's like, just put some stuff in the hair and go. Yeah.
I love that you said though that you reveal the kind of like the what goes on behind the scenes with your magic. So
I
great
always
example.
do. I always do. Even when I was a performing magician, I like to do a trick, show them how it was done, and then do another one that confused them, and then I show them how that's done, and then show them another one that confused them, and then I left it. And it was like, wait, but I thought you were gonna show. It's like it almost makes it better. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. I really love
Mm.
that. Yeah. And then we almost found a point of disagreement and then found out no,
Almost.
we actually
Yeah.
violently agreed on
Yeah. Yeah.
that. And then we thought we ought to hit record and actually start to
Hmm.
capture some of it. But
Hmm.
we've got another really juicy conversation. And I'm already feeling part of the reason we had, as you know, the kind of pre-chat is I was thinking like, oh, I really want to make sure we kind of capture the kind of nuance and the sensitivity. And I'm already like thinking like, oh gosh, there's just so much, like even just in that pre-conversation, realizing like how much juice is here in
Mm.
this particular topic. So I'm so looking forward to it.
Awesome. Me too.
So we're talking about children and magic. And
Mm.
as you were just reminding me, when we agreed, I think we did the topic last time around like magic in general,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then realized that hang on, we've got a whole conversation we need to now have about children and magic. And then we were
Hmm.
very, I think I don't know if we touched on this on the last show or afterwards, but talking about this idea of that kind of wildness in children that predisposes them really to magic, and then our
Hmm.
role as parents. And so I'd love for you to kind of set the scene there because
Mm.
you remembered that and I hadn't. So take it
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. I mean, like so much of the work that I do, and I think you do as well, that like is about helping people to unlearn the things that they've learned through, society growing up that has stamped out their connection to magic and to living magically, right? And to me, I don't look at that as like, oh, that's bad and that's wrong. I look at it as like that's to a certain degree, that's a functional part of becoming socialized and being able to function in the modern world. Like,
Mm,
your idea of like reason and rationale and logic and the scientific method and all these things, they're part of the journey, and you have to
mm,
learn them and kind of go all in to really get them. But there's a cost to it, and that's just part of how it is. And so it's like it's a spiral. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is helping people return to that kind of more innate aspects of themselves, their intuitions, the kind of magical way of seeing and experiencing life. So it's just so interesting because we do that in our day job, and then with our kids we have to almost, of course, and I think that's what we're going to talk about today, right? Like how do we both do the work that we do with our clients with our kids, and at the same time do the opposite, which is to like have them think rationally, like. And I think maybe I brought the example, like, because my son asked, what's the difference between a dragon and a dinosaur,
mm.
because
Yes,
neither of
yeah.
them are here, right?
Mm,
And so it's like, how do you distinguish that in a way that really honors magic, but also gives them access to this map of reality that's useful in life, called reason and logic and quote unquote truth,
mm.
history, all these things. And so I find that such an interesting path to navigate. And yeah, I think that's why we're both excited to talk about it.
Yeah. Oh, you've re-excited me, if that's a term. I already
Mm.
love so much of what you've said just there. There's I think firstly, what you've named there at the beginning in terms of actually, there might be things that are unserving to humans, to the world at large, in terms of our modern culture. But right now it's here, and
Hmm.
we can either fight with it or we can learn to live with it in a way
Hmm.
that kind of works for us and recognize that this modern culture is largely devoid of magic. And so that's
Hmm.
something that would want to
Hmm.
reclaim. And I think that's a really good way of naming it to start with. Like ultimately, the world is as it is. and knowing how to navigate in it is a really useful thing that, as you're saying, as parents I think it is an important part of our role. And I think that dinosaur dragon one's a great example, because there is, I mean, even as you're saying it, I had this sort of sense of like, yeah, but we don't even know for sure that dragons weren't real. And yet there is this kind of agreed upon reality at large that in our culture, at least, dragons aren't and dinosaurs were. And understanding, again, using this as a kind of like example and metaphor, I think is a really helpful one, because there's absolute nuance in that example. And yet there is this kind of commonly agreed upon reality. And it's that we're kind of talking about, how do we allow our children to kind of like work with that in a way that will serve.
Yeah, I think the fact that neither of them are, but one of them was in a particular frame of reference is like that nuance that my son was trying to figure out. Because it's like things that are real are here and things that aren't real are not here, like with your eyes. That kind of works for a lot of things, but not dinosaurs, right?
Yeah.
What if we had a dragon skeleton, or maybe something, So I think that, yeah, I mean, even the way that you approach dragons, so we don't have any evidence, the popular opinion is that they never existed. So even your relationship to it as uncertain, I think that's the dance. I think if the only way that we can help our kids to live in the world of rationality and reason is to be absolute certainty, then we're kind of holding it too tightly.
Yeah.
But I think if we can be like, most people, most of the time, believe that dragons never existed and that they were just an idea and just I don't even want to say just magic, because that kind of brings magic down, right? So we got to find our language for it. That they were pretended, that they were in the imagination. I talk about myth with my son and what myth is, and he's 6 years old. And I think that like, that's what, I guess I didn't realize it until we're talking about it now, but one of the ways that I try to meet these conversations is to not be certain about anything, not even to be absolute certain about dinosaurs. I mean, even within that realm, there's this awesome new documentary out right now by, what's the guy that does all the animal documentaries? Richard, the British guy. Not Richard.
You've now made it vanish from my mind as well.
Oh,
I know
you know who it is. He's like 95 and still doing nature docs. He's got the best voice ever.
One of the most awesome people on the planet. Yeah.
Yeah. So the new documentary about dinosaurs, and it's like, oh, T-Rexes actually swam. And so they're like crossing the ocean to an island. It's like, okay, we didn't know that was the case, but that's evidently true now.
Also, just freeze for a moment. Can your mind even can you imagine that? Because at the moment, I
couldn't, but then I saw the documentary and they did an incredible job. I mean, it looks like it's real. It looks real. I mean, it's insane. Yeah.
T-Rex doggy paddling. They did.
With just 2 legs, because their little hands were just splish splashing on the surface. They're like, their big legs were swimming. And their babies behind them. Like, literally, I mean, it was epic. But that's what I mean, right? Like, that's a movement in the direction of dragons as far as where we were 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, if
right?
they can
like,
swim, fly.
Right, and then they're fighting in the ocean with other, like, animals. It's like, oh, yeah, can they fly? Right, exactly. They did devolve into birds, dinosaurs. And so, like, a little bit on, and actually that's really healthy science. And we saw that in the recent pandemic. There's the scientific approach, which is to not say that you're certain. And then there's like the, what the approach is by the government with the health organization. This is actually, you have to wear the mask. And the scientists are like, well, we're figuring it out. And so I think actually good science is a bit more magical anyway. That is, when it becomes doctrine, it's not actually good science anymore, because it does losing the grip on the value of uncertainty. So I try to, I guess both as a scientist, my background is in science, and as a magician, I try to approach it the way that it sounds like you do, just the way you spoke about it. How you spoke about dragons, like, well, most people believe they weren't real. It's like, but we don't know for sure. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I was just thinking, I'd forgotten for a moment your background's in science. My father's was too. And more and more, and I think we touched on this last time, more and more seems to me that kind of true scientists, in quote marks, often are have this kind of relationship to science that very much it kind of like it is built on hypothesis, it's built on inquiry, it's built on not knowing. So to me, that makes complete sense. And I think that very much was how I was raised, because my father had that kind of very much a kind of dual scientific and magical mindset, which actually aren't any different when we really boil it down to things.
Right.
So yeah, I love that. And it's with, not to make this all about dragons, as cool as they are, like when we look at all these different cultures from all around the world that seem like they've evolved very separately with no kind of commonalities, we see dragons being mentioned in all of these different cultures in very similar ways, like how they look, what their role is, or their abilities. We see these commonalities. So it kind of like, as you say, even these things that we've agreed are fantasy, it's like, it's interesting. There's something going on there too. So more and more, as much as I used to grip onto this is evidence, this isn't, it kind of like, again, I think the more we can go on the idea of this is a kind of like currently agreed upon reality, but like, let's hold that fairly lightly because we're probably going to find out something else.
Yeah. I forget the quote, but there's a quote about magic. I think all magic is sufficiently misunderstood technology, something like that. And so it's like, if you go back in time, like every scientific theory that was like accepted as fact has been pretty much, not every one, but like so many of them have been like overruled by like a new discovery. And like prior to that, though, that would have been considered magic. It's correlation, not cause, or that you're just imagining that. And then it's like, oh, actually, the Earth does go around the sun. Oops, and then it goes on and on and on all the way to even now, even quantum theory and Einstein's relativity is they're finding the edges and the limits of that. Like, oh, things can go faster than the speed of light. Interesting. And so, we take it as fact, and then suddenly it starts to become threatened. But before that, anybody who speaks anything beyond that is a heretic or is just thinking magically. And then you find out that, so, yeah.
No, but I do think, although we've kind of now gone kind of off topic in terms of where we started with children, I think this is a really helpful kind of a basis for us to agree upon.
I think we need to have that grounding.
Yeah, I think so. Because again, it's like, even like you said, there's that kind of, there's a repression of magic in a way needed, as you've said, in order for them to become like functional, rational human beings. And understanding what we've just been talking about really helps that kind of holding it lightly too. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you then have to share that with, and I think this is also a really important part. There's obviously some people make the choice to not have their children participate in the kind of world at large for however long. And that's going to be like degrees of that and, ages where you decide that you want to do more of that. But just speaking personally as a mother, my children are 13 and 11. And it's been a challenge for sure. There's been times where I've thought like, oh, do I want them in kind of, mainstream culture, having their heads filled with all the kind of narratives of our culture? Yeah. And then I'm more and more recognizing like, but there is a way of almost having like a meta narrative that includes the fact that narrative's going to be there, but you don't actually have to, you can know it, but you don't actually need to kind of like believe it as well. Which I think is kind of like another level on top of what we're talking about. It's kind of like, no, these are the commonly agreed narratives, and there can be like this meta way of holding it as well that isn't kind of like, therefore that's all wrong, but almost like there is a kind of like something beyond that too.
I think maybe we talked about like we talked about Keegan's developmental levels last time, right? And so if it's true that humans are developing psychologically each generation a little bit further, they're becoming more able to be object to their internal experience and to the sense of self and be able to witness it and talk about it. And then from that place, have some agency with the cultivation of it, and thus be able to navigate complexity in the world better. Then it just makes sense that like the parenting is going to mean that the next generation advances even faster. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with my kids, which it sounds like you're doing too, is to have a conversation with them about what is in the world and a conversation about that conversation, which is a second order possibility. And if you're like, oh, they won't get that until they're older, then you're actually discounting the fact that no, actually they're probably going to be more conscious than you, younger than you were.
Oh yeah.
Like and that's how it works. And if you pretend that they can't get there, then you miss out on the possibility that they are the evolution. They are the next generation of understanding of cognitive capacity. So the other day I was talking to my son about like, can you hear the thoughts inside your head? What do they sound like? What are they saying? And then he just sat there and looked. He's like, oh yeah, it's saying I'm gonna hit you. And then it's like, and then it's like, ha ha ha. You know, it's like, but being able to have the conversation about the conversation, and whether it's about the internal dialogue or the myths in the world, I think is another great way of holding it lightly, having a little bit of uncertainty, holding, the whole conversation like that way. So yeah.
I love what you've just shared there about the recognizing they're likely to be more conscious than we were at a younger age. And an example just popped into my mind. I don't think I shared this on our last episode, but I'll share it anyway because it's so relevant to what we're talking about. So my children go to mainstream schools, which are largely kind of run on systems that kind of work en masse to kind of keep people controlled. And the more that I saw that kind of like they're going to be doing things that don't make sense to me personally as a mother, and yet they are there and they're there for various reasons. And how can I help my children kind of like navigate them, be in that system, but not be kind of like consumed by it? I mean, I'm going to need to kind of have conversations about those processes and why those processes are there so that they can kind of see it again with this like degree of elevation. And so from a really young age, we were having conversations like, for example, the way that teachers would use, I don't know, star charts and punishments in order to kind of maintain that order in a classroom. And to recognize like that's what's happening. It doesn't make you inherently, good, bad. Right. It's just a way of controlling a group of children. And from so young, I'm talking like 5 or 6, my children would come home and name what had happened in terms of that day, children being kind of like marked down on the star chart or, this happening, that happening, and would just name like, oh yes, because, the teacher needs to do that. And she also put me to here, but I kind of know, like, it doesn't really matter. It's like, it's just a chart. And like, they just knew it. They
had the context from a higher level than most kids probably would. Yeah.
And it was, it was their, that was just felt so natural to them. It wasn't like it was so that they could see this from a degree of elevation. It blew my mind. But there was also just like a real, not a kind of like victim-y, like making the teacher wrong energy for that either, because that wasn't how I named it. I really was clear, like it's like this for a certain reason. Teachers doing their best within a system that's set up that way. And you could really hear that kind of like almost like sweetness in love, like recognizing like, yeah, the teacher's just doing their best. They're using this system that you told us about, mummy, and that's how it happens. And it like I could give you so many examples of that, but like from a really young age, they could see that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, Asher's young, but I'm starting that conversation with him about like rules and following rules and why there's rules and laws. It's like, it's not the only way to do things, but like, if you don't have parking spots, then cars will crash into each other. And so these are here for us, and like creating a relationship to those kinds of things and structures are like, as like not the truth, but useful. Not the only way, but it's a way that works. And then when that comes into the home too, and like, how can we create structures that are not true, but useful, not the only way, but the way that we do it because it works for us.
Yeah. I think manners is another good example of that. It's again, kind of, and also I guess swearing, which I think you call curse words over there.
Cursing,
but it's like recognizing again, like none of these things are kind of like, again, true, and yet words do have power and do have an impact. And again, it's kind of like giving them that understanding of, each of these words that you're choosing to use will have certain impacts.
That's what exactly how I'm approaching it. And I feel like curse words or swear words are such an awesome context to help my son get a sense of the power of his speaking. Because there's a difference between saying, don't say that word, that's bad, that's wrong, that's unacceptable, as a projection of society's unacceptance of you and the vision of you and the image of your father, right? Like that's like, fuck, I don't want him like agreeing to that. That's just gonna like be a complex he's gonna need a life coach for later. So instead, so instead I'm like, I mean, you can say the curse word by yourself, but don't say it around mommy and daddy or around other people because it hurts them. Watch what happens when you say it. Do you see how when you say that word, what happens to mommy, what happens to her face? What can you imagine? Like, can you feel what happens in her heart? Like, and then it's like, oh, wow. And then still there might be like a little bit of masochisticness that's like they still say it, but they're at least discovering the impact. It's a development of empathy. Maybe you could see through the dark side or whatever, but like, it's still that thing. It's like finding out. It's the same kind of thing with rough and tumble play, right? Like you play and you go rough until the kid cries or screams or the dog yelps when the puppies are, and then it's like, oh, that's the limit. It's like, how can I say this word? How loud? You can say like the F word, like, and it's like, nobody got hurt. But if I say it loud enough, mommy's like, hey, or something, or daddy, it's like, oh, wow. Or the times that daddy has slipped and yelled it, and that didn't feel good, did it? When daddy said that word in the house, see? I'm sorry. And so like, we're going to make mistakes, but I think it's a beautiful way to introduce our kids to the power of magic, cursing and swearing.
Yeah. That's a quote, right?
Cursing. It's a curse.
Yes.
Like, look, literally it's magic. You're casting a curse, a spell. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love this conversation. I really do. So I feel like to an extent, we've established this sense of, so we do need to kind of, we kind of said at the beginning something like repress the wildness. And I think there's probably a more nuanced way to say that. But
it's not repress. It's like, I would say raising order from chaos, creating some structure and some like, it's like domesticating a wild animal. Like, we have kittens, they're not lions. But they're not humans, right? There's like this middle ground but it makes it functional for them to live in the house and, to come in. We don't let the feral cats in, but we do let our cats in because they have a different way of being that has been cultivated. And it's the same with kids, right? We want to like manners, we don't want them sitting on the table, like eating with their hand. Well, I say that's what my kids do. They sit on the table and eat with their hands. They're half Indian, and they're like, one of them's 2. The 2-year-old sits on the table. So, but at a certain point, we want them not sitting on the table and maybe eating with their hands if they're having curry, but like otherwise with a fork. So, yeah, it's finding our manners is a great example of like the value that's maybe antithetical to the wild.
Yeah, I love that. So, going back to what we were talking about, that knowing that kind of there is a usefulness in that, and I think both of us share the same intention, I think, and let me know if you feel differently. For me, that's possible to both raise children with that kind of, understanding that's useful to be part of our culture, and not to kind of like train that magic out of them, so they then have to then work with someone many years later to reclaim it. It's like they can actually grow up with that magic intact, and I think you're with me in that feels possible and is what you're choosing. Yeah, like even in the kind of the way that I think we often use magic with our clients, like about willing things into existence and like using your imagination to create. Right. And so like I encourage my son to do that too. And it doesn't always work because like just because you imagine a bicycle doesn't mean I'm going to buy you another one today because that one's blue and yours is red. But like there's then there's places that this does work, and being in that whole conversation about how come I close my eyes and wish and it didn't happen. And it's like, how do you talk about that in a way that encourages that magical way of being, but doesn't collapse it into like disbelief. Oh, you said it was going to work. And they have this attachment to immediate outcome because of the other things that we're teaching them, like manners. And so it's, it's always back and forth. It's always back and forth.
Another thing, speaking of which, my 2-year-old just came to my window right there.
Oh, too cute.
I'm just going to lock the door, otherwise.
Okay. Otherwise, he'll be joining us.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to drop in here, just to see if it takes us somewhere, is we met with my some kind of therapist that my son has been going to see after school, kind of like body movement, integrating infantile responses, which was really, really awesome. And anyway, she mentioned to us that she has a bunny, and she was asking about was a bunny being a mammal, not a lizard, not a reptile, because reptiles lay eggs. And then she's like, that's right, they don't lay eggs. She's like, but what about the Easter bunny? And she's like, oh, is the Easter bunny a mammal or a reptile? And so that's like a way of bringing him to the question, like, with your kids, do you do the Easter bunny? Do you do the tooth fairy? Do you do Father Christmas? Because that's an interesting context for like this conversation as well.
Yes, it really is. Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of outing myself a bit here, because I think it can be such a polarized conversation around that. And we really went there with the whole Easter bunny and Father Christmas thing, to a point where I'm going to admit like an embarrassing level, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But I've always had this kind of, I think, again, because I was raised by a father that was very honest, from a very young age, he would be very, very honest with me. And whilst at the same time being very magical, which it sounds, again, there's a paradox here. But I really did feel that, if I asked him a question about something that was rational, he would give me an honest answer. Or sometimes there was a particular example where a friend of his had gone to prison, I think, for selling cannabis. And whatever age I said, where's he gone? And he obviously thought, no, this probably is age inappropriate, and actually just said, you're not old enough yet for me to tell you that. But I really, that's something that stayed with me, because I so appreciated, rather than making up a story and lying about it, he was just really honest, no, right now, you're not old enough to know that. Which was a rare thing. I generally got told probably more than I could have, I was able to metabolize. Anyway, and despite that kind of, radical honesty in so many areas, I do remember believing in Father Christmas. And he also brought in many other magical things. I've got one of my favorite memories. He built me a kind of wooden toy kitchen when I was very small, like a cooker kind of unit, but small. And I don't know to this day how he did it. It probably wasn't that hard to confuse a 3-year-old. But as far as I was concerned, he actually heated soup up on this wooden cooker that had no controls to heat, but somehow he magically heated soup on this cooker. And it remains one of my favorite and earliest memories. And so there was this kind of real honesty and this real kind of magical way of living, which did involve not telling me the whole truth. So when it came to having children, I was just like, I want them to be able to experience that kind of fantasy magic. And so the way that we did it was, we never directly lied, it wasn't like if they said, is it true? I'd find a way of not directly saying yes, there definitely is one. And yet, absolutely, Easter in this household was a massive event.
I mean, that garden with the eggs must be epic. Yeah.
We'd invite everyone over. It was like a real epic event, and it still is. And this is the embarrassing bit. So bearing in mind, I've said my son's 13. Because of COVID, it was partly because of COVID and them not going to school.
You've just kept him indoctrinated into believing in the Easter bunny?
I've told him just before.
Oh, you've told him?
Easter, before this Easter. And
how did you do it?
I'll tell you that in a moment, but this is the embarrassing part. So my husband made me promise to tell my son before he went to secondary school, because he's like, all the other children are going to know. He can't be the last of his class to know. And so my intention was to do that. And then we hit COVID. So he basically wasn't in school. So it got right before Christmas. Well, he doesn't know. Why not have one final Christmas? And then 2 Christmases went round with that same rationale.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And then we were like, oh my goodness. And now we're about to have Easter and I still haven't told him, and he's now 13. And so my friend, one of my best friends and my husband were like, "You've got to tell them this is ridiculous."
Yeah.
Because by now my youngest had also started secondary school.
Yeah. Oh
Anyway,
boy.
I did this really, they said it was super magical how I did it. A week or so before Easter, I kind of hid these little letters in the garden with some chocolate, set them off on a kind of hunt to find them, brought them back, and the letter in there was a letter from what I called, there's a film called Guardians of the
Galaxy.
no, Guardians of
Oh.
the Rise or something like that. It's basically
Oh.
all the different figures, like the Tooth Fairy, Father Christmas,
Oh,
all the
okay,
different
cool.
ones in one film. And so I wrote a letter from those guardians saying, we're now handing like the kind of passing the honor on to you. And now you're the guardians for the next generation. And they were kind of reading it going, what does this mean, mummy? What does this mean? And then they realized, and I was like dreading that moment where they realized, so does that mean that Father Christmas isn't real? But they've really got like, he's both real and not real, because he does exist as a kind of, as the magic, and now they're the magic. And then I then gave them an egg to hide each other. So they got the experience of being the Easter Bunny, which they said afterwards, we love that, mummy, and we're really glad you didn't tell us until now. And the way you've done it is so magical. We're going to do that with our children. So I was like, oh, I got it right in the end.
Phew. No, that's my plan too. Like being Father Christmas, being the Easter Bunny. I've read about that before. I think it's a beautiful way. And so I'm kind of setting my son up for that by like just blurring the lines like you did. It's like, it's not necessarily true. It's like, like when you're being a dragon, it's just like starting to like, we can all imagine, we can play the role of things and stuff like that. So I think that's, the central theme of this conversation. The path is uncertainty, blurry lines. Like this is a continuum of possibility. And I think if we can dance that, then there's not going to be like a traumatic event of an unrevealing into the absolute truth, as if there is one that you could have access to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it feels like a kind of softer landing, as it were, which actually calls to mind. I was saying to you that today there's been this kind of really, I mean, every day's magic is with there one way or another. And right now in our program called Waking Our Medicine, we're actually in Magic Month, and it's been so alive. I don't know if you find the same things. It's kind of whatever you're teaching, like you're being taught it at the same time. And I woke up this morning and I had this realization that was something along the lines of, and it was like a choice I'd already made, and I only just realized I'd made it this morning, which was, I'm actually just not available to live anything other than magically now. It just makes no sense to kind of engage with the world at a mundane level. It just all is through a magical lens. And I'm like, I don't know when that happened, but that's what's happened. And I read out, I'll read it. I'm sure you know this quote. It's one of my favorites. I read out this Terence McKenna quote in today's Waking Wild Medicine Circle. Nature loves courage. You make the commitment, and nature will respond to that commitment by removing impossible obstacles. Dream the impossible dream, and the world will not grind you under. It will lift you up. This is the trick. This is what all these teachers and philosophers who really counted, who really touched the alchemical gold, this is what they understood. This is the shamanic dance in the waterfall. This is how magic is done, by hurling yourself into the abyss and discovering it's a feather bed.
I haven't heard it, and I love it.
Oh, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's just like, just gorgeous. It's like, it's so, the words themselves are so magical. And I realized today that quote has been like so present for me for several years now. And today I suddenly realized that as we live more and more magically, where I used to relate to that kind of abyss of being those like big things, when we might choose a big creation, whether that be a kind of house move or a new offering that feels like it's on our edge, I used to see that was the abyss. And then today I suddenly realized like, to live magically is to kind of choose the abyss and experience the feather bed at all different levels throughout each day. And like today, I had this example where I had a really beautiful moment where I had someone who is such a like dream soul client email me, and it was just one of those moments where you're like, oh my goodness, like feather bed moment. And then simultaneously had a really difficult experience later in the day that was like the kind of hurling in the abyss. And I was like, of course, it requires both things all the time to be unfolding. And so it feels like it doesn't directly relate to children, but I just wanted to share that with you. And firstly, I guess, understand how you do or don't relate to it. But then I feel like there might be something here when it comes to children. I trust this has come up for a reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's those, I think I can relate first and foremost to the experience, the initial experience of magic is throwing yourself into the abyss of something big and obvious, like some big project or thing in your life. And then slowly realizing that actually there's like these micro abysses throughout every day, that are actually where most of the magic lives, or the rubber of magic meets the road, I guess you could say. And so with my sons, mostly with Asher, because Rumi's almost, he's not even 2 yet. Actually, shit, he's 2 today. This is his birthday.
No
He's 2. Happy birthday, Rumi. Yeah. But mostly with Asher, like, throwing myself into the abyss is like taking a risk with my parenting approach. For me, the choice of school is that I was listening to you talk about the schools that your kids are in and how you provide almost a magical counterbalance to like the industrial kind of like approach that they have. But we've chosen a Steiner school for Asher. So we call them Waldorf schools here in the US. And it's so magical. I mean, they sing, they dance, they have mythology, everyday storytelling. I mean, it's like, and it's a kind of half outdoor school. So his life is so magical, and to the degree that it has me leaning into my edge, which is because they're like, they don't even focus on reading and writing until like way later than the regular schools, and their belief is that they're going to do just as well if you stay with the process. So that has me like, I'm thrown into the abyss, and like I hope when he turns 19 or so that I have landed on the feather bed of like he still knows how to make it in the world, even though I mean. He lives so magically. He said, "Dad, I'm going out on the balcony to sing." And he just goes out and sings about dinosaurs. I mean, I'm sure all kids are magical, but wherever he lands on that spectrum, really, I'm talking about my worries and concerns that he's not learning to read or write or do math at 6 years old. Right. And that's the plan for that school. So, but like, so how do I meet that? And it's the same way that I meet everything that I do magically. Like we've chosen to put him there, not because we've reasoned it, but because we feel called. And it seems true for us. It's what brought us here. And so like our parenting is going to be the courage to land on the feather bed with him, as is yours. But like for us, the school is one choice for that. I mean, I guess that's kind of a big thing because it's like it's education, but I can relate to there being moments throughout the day, like and we talked about deceiving our kids with Father Christmas and these kind of imagined these dragons, maybe not. But there's also like, I mean, that's a whole conversation. I don't know if we have the time for it, but like immersing myself in deception as a loving and creative act, with my kids, but also just in the world in general, because for my entire life, I value honesty very much. And I was very rigid about always telling what I believed was the absolute truth. But I've just found that like sometimes the most loving thing with my son is to not tell him the truth. Maybe I could learn something from your dad about telling him the truth that I'm not telling him the truth. Like Darren Brown says, I'm always honest about my dishonesty. But like with the chicken, we have got chickens, and I've got to round up the wild ones so they don't eat all the feed from the ones that we have here. And he's so heartbreaking for him if I trap them and release them down the road. It's like a big pressure for him. They're all his chickens. And so there's been times where I've told him that I don't know what happened. It's like a little bit not true. And so for me, that's the abyss as well, because like I'm trusting in this intuitive call to not tell him the truth. Even though rationally I'm like, no, I either should, it's like, so Yeah, I guess all parenting takes courage. We could put it in the
Yeah,
domain of magic, but parenting takes courage in general.
it really does. It really does. Oh gosh, there was something you just said that oh, what was it? What was
I
it?
know I said a lot of different things. Was it about the chickens or before that?
Well, I'm super, super jealous of your children's school. That's great
Mm,
choice. If there'd
mm,
been an option like this kind of locally, that's certainly what we would have chosen too. So yeah. What was it? I think it was your mention of myth, I think,
mm,
that I wanted to pick up on, which was a lot of the work that we do is mythical archetypal work. And over the last couple of years, I've kind of like begun, I mean, there isn't really a beginning, you know, ultimately we live seeped in myth anyway, but
mm,
like more consciously introducing that to my children, and particularly kind of like working consciously with archetypes.
mm-hmm,
And again, noticing how naturally this comes.
mm-hmm,
And so with my son in particular, he seems to have this really strong feeling. In fact, that was interesting itself. You're talking earlier about talking to your son about him hearing his thoughts. I only found out about a year ago. We were talking about archetypes, and I suddenly realized my son has, I think, aphantasia, you know, where you don't see images in your mind's eye. And
mm.
I've got a like super visual mind. And so I was
Wow.
just like, wow, I didn't know that. But he really, when I was talking to them, I found out because I was actually saying, you know, like imagine a king. And they were both sharing their experiences of a king. And I realized my daughter was like, she's probably got a very visual imagination like mine. She was
Mm,
describing this exquisite detail of, you know, these like, you know, furs, and he's got this kind of crown with this kind of jewel, and he looks like this. And then I realized, and this is how I realized, it was like nothing my son was saying was visual. It was all about
mm,
feeling this sense of like calm and strength. And so each
mm.
time, but the point of this isn't so much the realizing my son had aphantasia, it was more the fact that they had such a strong sense of the king archetype.
Yeah.
I wasn't saying
Mm,
imagine a particular king, I was just saying imagine a king. And then I did the same, I think, with a magician and something else, warrior, I think. And I realized that yes, you know, as we've been told, there is this just absolute you know, whether we call it as the kind of collector's unconscious, we absolutely do have these archetypes available to us without needing to be taught them.
mm-hmm.
And more again, like recognizing like this is natural to us. We're already like unconsciously going to be molding ourselves around archetypes and stereotypes. What if we make
Mm.
that conscious as a magical act?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I wasn't sure how well kind of children would relate to that. And then, of course, they're going to, you know, they dress up as superheroes from a really young age. Of
Sure, of
course, they have
course.
this like
Right.
already in them. But my
Yes.
son in particular has this real clear identification with this idea of being princely. And so it's
Mm.
become this just really like wonderful shorthand when we're talking about how he might respond to something, relate to something, think
Like the
about
manners can
something.
plug right into that, right?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
incredible. And it's just like it seems it's like got its own spirit, like just as archetypes do. You know,
Mm.
that's very much how I relate to them. Like they have their own spirit, but it's like brought to life this whole magical being that's
Mm.
him, but it's a kind of this
Mm.
like bigger, more magical version of him.
Mm.
So that's what it made me think of. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of that. But it was used more mentioning myths that made me think of it.
Yeah, no, I think the archetypes at the heart of mythology are powerful. And, you know, again, going back to the school, the Steiner, the Waldorf school, they embrace that as well. And every birthday celebration, they have a king ceremony, and he came home with a crown that he was this
Oh
beautiful, like, crown with
wow.
jewels on it and fabric made that they have. And so we actually named our son Asher Kian. His middle name is Kian, which means king. And so
Oh,
we have a lot of conscious conversations about how he's a king, being a king, but also again holding it lightly. It's like not like a real king. And I said I'm a king too, and he said, but your name doesn't mean king. I said I'm not a king by blood or name, but by declaration. And he's like, what does declaration mean? And then we talk about like how you can just create something to be through your speaking. And so, but going back to the archetypal thing, I think it's, you can really, it's if you have this like it's either or, then you make that invalid. You're not a superhero. You're not a king. And it's like, well, maybe there's a continuum, or maybe it's an aspect of what you are. It's like a king is a way of being. It's part of you, you know, and it's not just a king by blood, like out there in the world. There's a way of being king. And so having that, again, that meta conversation that kind of creates a bigger space for them to hold that, and they can go into it and keep going into it, but knowing it's not the only thing where the complex kind of takes you over, and then like they've got some kind of like infantile grandiosity going on, or stamping it out completely and being like, I'm past the age where I can pretend that I'm a superhero. But there's a real function to, you know, being embodied in the experience that you're a shaman, or that you are a king, or you're a warrior. You know, if you've got to fire somebody in your company, having the king archetype alive in you in that moment can be useful. Having the lover alive in that moment can be useful. And generative in the world, right? But obviously we're not talking about going to the extent of it where you believe that you actually are that too. And so I think that if we show up that way with our kids from the beginning, then they can continue to engage in these complexes, these archetypes, as they grow up, instead of playing them out right now because you're a kid and it's okay, and then having to stop and repress it, and then again having to hire a life coach later to help them access it and bring that archetype back into a conscious relationship with themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Again, it's just everywhere, isn't it? It's like both the kind of rational reality in quote marks, hold that lightly, and then the magical reality, hold that lightly too.
Yeah.
We're kind of coming up on time, sadly. Where do you think we should what do you think is going to be the most magical way for us to finish?
Well, like we always finish, talking about what we're going to talk about on our next interview. No, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, when thinking about the kids, you know that before I was a parent, it was like, you know, the children are our future. It's kind of like one of those phrases that come in one ear and go out the other. It's like in the middle, it might be like, yeah, obviously, but like you don't really feel the sense of that. Well, for me, I was like, it wasn't a big deal. And then, but now, like, as I'm getting older and it's really clear that my children are the future, of course I care more about the planet and the world and where it ends up in 40, 50 years, because they're going to be living in it and I'm not. So I care about it for them and their kids' sakes, like emotionally, but like also the sense that like in 20, 30 years, 40 years, whenever I'm gone or pretty close to gone, like, my kids are the only shot I have at creating a more beautiful world. And in that same way, like, be the change you want to see in the world. I think it's like, be the parent you want to see your kids be, to be the change in the world. And so for me, it's like, I have this declaration that like my impact on the world is a direct result of my commitment to create myself in relationship to my kids. Like who I am as a dad and a husband is the central point from which all of my contribution to the world unfolds. Sure, I have my clients and I have my impact on them too, but it's all cultivated in the home. And this was inspired by Gandhi. I read a book called Gandhi the Man, where it talks about like how he cultivated the capacity for nonviolence, and basically it was in the home. He just thought, if I could live a day without a single nonviolent thought towards my wife, then we might have a chance at liberating India. It's like, shit. So I take a lot of inspiration from that and apply it in my parenting. And it's like, so I hold myself to a high bar and try to treat myself with kindness and love, and magically as well. Like use magic as a way of finding out how to bring magic through my parenting. Trusting in the king archetype as it speaks to me through automatic writing about how to run the house, how to run the household, how to parent the kids. Right, like like inviting magic as the means to guide me in bringing magic into the parenting, I would say. Yeah.
I love that so much. Yeah, I really do. It's reminded me of something my shamanic teacher shared recently, which was one of his teachers is an indigenous shaman. And he was talking about how people kind of, get infused by all the wonderful ideas of kind of, taking out the teachings and changing the world. And he just said, start with your family, start with your
Mm,
family. And
mm,
it's one of those lines that just kind of keeps coming up to me. It's like, yes, you know, we can create beautiful things in the world, but like not by not starting with our family.
mm-hmm.
That's yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
You're
Let's
so welcome.
yeah, we'll talk after we finish recording about what we're going to record next time. But
Yeah, cool.
for now, I'm really happy we got the chance to explore this gorgeous topic. And where can people find out about you
I
and
don't know
you?
that we had launched our new website at the last one, but the new website is wearecreating.com. So that's
Mm,
our company, our trainings and our workshops are all there. So have a look.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Until
Thank
next
you,
time.
Lian. See ya.